33 inches. That is the measurement recorded in the Jefferson City Tribune on September 3, 1885. Not the height of a man, the length of a single femur. I read that number and I set it down. I accepted the explanation that followed it: rural exaggeration, frontier sensationalism, the kind of story a small newspaper prints to sell copies in a slow week. I didn't question it. I filed it away as a curiosity and moved on. Then I started looking at the maps more carefully. Specifically, I started looking at where those caves were, the limestone bluffs along the Osage River, 20 miles upstream from what is now Bagnell Dam. I pulled the 1931 Army Corps survey. I pulled the WPA field reports from the mid-1930s. I pulled the geological records from Missouri's state archives, and what I found was not a single anomaly. It was a pattern, quiet, consistent, and precise enough that once I saw it, I could not find an explanation that satisfied me the way the official one is supposed to. The official record is not complicated. The Army Corps of Engineers, beginning in the early decades of the 20th century, identified the Ozark region as ideal terrain for reservoir development. Steep valleys, seasonal rivers prone to flooding, rural communities that needed electricity. The justification was infrastructure, progress. The dams came, and with them the water, and the valleys became lakes, and the lakes became destinations, and the official story closed. What the official story does not linger on, what it mentions, if at all, in passing, is what those valleys contained before the water came. Not the towns, not the farmland, something older. I want you to hold one detail as we move forward. In the decades before, the Osage River Valley was submerged beneath what would become one of the largest man-made reservoirs in the United States. That valley was being excavated. Bones were being found. Records were being filed. And then the institutions that received those records went quiet in a way that is, at minimum, worth examining. The water did not erase what was down there. It simply made certain that almost no one could reach it again. The thread appeared on Reddit sometime in the spring. I won't give the exact date because I don't want to expose the person who posted it, and I want to be clear that I cannot independently verify everything they claimed. What I can tell you is what they wrote, and why one specific detail in it refused to leave me alone. The post was asking a simple question: why does the Army Corps of Engineers, a military division, not a civilian agency, maintain jurisdiction over so many recreational lakes across the Ozark region? The person said they grew up near Clinton, Missouri, on the edge of Truman Lake. They wrote about their grandfather, about the stories he used to tell. About valleys that no longer exist, about cave systems in the river bluffs, about bones that people found in those caves in the years before the water rose. The thread is filled with the usual responses. Old folklore, rural legend, the kind of polite dismissal that sounds reasonable until you look at what's actually being dismissed. But here is the detail that stopped me. The grandfather had not heard these stories secondhand. He had been there. He had watched the valley flood. He was not repeating something passed down to him. He was describing something he had witnessed with his own eyes, and he had described it consistently, according to his grandchild, for the remainder of his life. I want to be careful here. One Reddit post is not evidence of anything. I am not presenting it as such. I'm presenting it as the question that sent me back to the archives, because the archives, it turns out, had been waiting for someone to look. If the gatekeepers of official history had their way, threads like that one would die in comment sections, dismissed by credentialed voices who never had to sit across from a grandfather and listen. If that troubles you, consider subscribing. This channel exists because some questions deserve more than a downvote. Now, back to the archives, because what they contain is far older than any Reddit thread. What I found there did not begin with folklore. It began with a railroad crew, a limestone bluff, and a measurement that the official record has spent nearly a century trying to contextualize away. September 3rd, 1885. That is the date I keep returning to, not because the newspaper account is conclusive. It isn't, but because of what happened to the physical evidence it described, and specifically because of what happened to it in relation to what came 46 years later. The Jefferson City Tribune account is specific in a way that casual frontier sensationalism typically is not. The workers were laying track for a railroad bridge across the Osage River. They broke through into a cave system in the limestone bluffs, not a shallow pocket, but an extensive passage showing what the article described as evidence of deliberate modification. Widened entry points, smoothed interior walls in sections. And inside, arranged in a manner the reporter characterized as intentional burial skeletal remains. The femur measurement was 33 inches. The skull circumference was recorded at 29 inches. I want to say that again precisely. A 33-inch femur does not suggest a large man. By standard anthropometric proportions, it suggests an individual approaching 9 feet in height. Representatives from the Missouri Historical Society were contacted. The bones were collected, and according to the Society's own transfer records, they were sent to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. After that, silence, not the silence of ongoing study, the silence of a file that stops. I'm not saying the Smithsonian destroyed anything. I am saying that the public record of what became of those remains is, at present, effectively empty. And I am saying that 46 years after those bones were removed from that valley, the Army Corps of Engineers completed Bagnell Dam, and the Osage River Valley, the precise valley where those caves were located, went underwater, permanently. If that silence troubles you the way it troubles me, hit the like button. Help push this research further than the official record was willing to go. Now, back to the valley, because the Osage discovery was not the last of its kind in this region, not even close. 18 years later, and 40 miles to the southeast, a farmer named Clarkson broke ground on a drainage project near the confluence of 2 small tributary creeks and struck something that was not soil and was not bedrock. What he found, according to the 1903 field correspondence, now held in fragmented form across 2 separate Missouri County archives, was stone chambers, not loose fieldstone, not a collapsed natural formation. Fitted limestone slabs, arranged in a rectangular configuration, sealed at the top with capstones that required, by the field correspondent's own estimate, more than 1 person to move. The state geologist's office sent a representative. The Smithsonian, which by this point had an established correspondence network across Missouri, was notified within weeks. I want to be precise about what the record shows next, because this is where I have to be careful. The artifacts and structural measurements documented in that initial field correspondence, dimensions, orientation, associated material, do not appear in any subsequent published report I have been able to locate. The follow-up visit happened, the evidence was transporting, and then the documentation trail, much like the one from 1885, simply grows quiet. What I can tell you is this: the land surrounding the Clarkson site changed hands within 4 years of that discovery. The transfer records are administrative and unremarkable on their surface, but hold that detail: land transfer, evidence removal, official silence. That sequence is going to become familiar. 2 finds, 2 valleys, 2 institutional responses that end in the same place, an empty public record, and, eventually, water. But the White River tells the most specific version of this story, and that is where we are going next. The White River runs south out of the Missouri Ozarks into Arkansas, cutting through some of the deepest karst terrain in the central United States. In 1922, a speleological survey, a formal cave mapping effort, not amateur exploration, documented an extensive network of caverns along the White River bluffs in what is now the Table Rock Lake Basin. The survey noted, in language that is measured and professional, and therefore worth reading carefully, that several of the cave chambers showed evidence of prior human habitation, and in 2 cases, what the surveyors described as structural modification inconsistent with known regional cultures. That survey sat in state records for 14 years. In 1936, WPA field workers conducting oral history and geographic documentation in the same river corridor recorded something more specific. 15 skeletons, described in the field report with the word gigantic, recovered from a bluff shelter approximately 6 miles upstream from where Table Rock Dam would later be constructed. The field report references the skeletons being photographed and crated for transport. I have not been able to locate those photographs. I have not been able to locate the transport destination. The 1936 WPA report exists. What it describes appears to have gone somewhere that the public record does not show. Table Rock Dam was completed in 1958. Bull Shoals Dam, 16 miles downstream, in 1952. Both projects were Army Corps. Both flooded the documented survey corridor completely. If you believe that history belongs to everyone and not to the agency that drowned it, subscribe and comment. I stand for the past. This research only continues if people push it forward. Now, back to the river, because what happens after the water rises is its own category of problem entirely. The dams were built, the water came, and then, and this is the part that took me longest to understand, the Army Corps stayed. Most federal infrastructure projects follow a predictable administrative arc. The agency builds the thing, manages the transition period, and then transfers long-term oversight to a civilian body, a state parks department, a regional water authority, and a local municipality. That is the standard model. That is how it works almost everywhere else. The Ozark reservoirs did not follow that model. The Army Corps of Engineers built these lakes, and the Army Corps of Engineers still controls them, not as a historical footnote. Actively, today, access points, shoreline regulations, permitted activities, restricted zones, all of it administered by a military engineering division whose original mandate was national defense infrastructure. I want to be careful not to overstate what that means. There are reasonable administrative explanations for long-term Corps management of water resources. I acknowledge that fully. What I cannot as easily explain is what happens during droughts. When water levels drop significantly, as they did across the Ozark reservoir system in 2012, and again in portions of the region in 2022, features emerge from the exposed lake bed. Foundations, stone arrangements. In at least 2 documented instances reported by local residents and regional news outlets, objects described as unusually large skeletal remains were reportedly observed in exposed sediment near former bluff lines. In both cases, the Corps moved quickly to restrict access to the affected shoreline sections. In both cases, the official explanations cited erosion safety concerns. That may be exactly what it was. I'm not saying otherwise, but hit the like button if you think these sites deserve independent examination before the water returns. This signal needs to reach people who can ask the right questions officially. Now, back to the pattern, because there is one more voice in this record that the official history has never adequately answered, and it was speaking long before the Army Corps ever arrived. The Osage people lived in these valleys for centuries before any surveyor arrived with a transit and a federal mandate. Their oral traditions, recorded in ethnographic documentation compiled by Francis La Flèche and published through the Bureau of American Ethnology in the early 20th century, contain references to what the Osage called the Little Old Men, and separately, the Ancient Ones, beings associated specifically with the river bluffs, the cave systems, and the deep valleys of the Ozark watershed. I want to be precise about what those accounts say and what they don't say. They do not describe giants in the sensationalist sense. They describe predecessors, people who came before, who were larger, who built within the stone, and who were gone before the Osage themselves arrived in the region. That account was not generated in response to the 1885 newspaper story. It predates it. The oral tradition was already there, embedded in the Osage ceremonial record, before a single railroad worker broke through into a single limestone bluff. Let me say that slowly. The indigenous memory of unusual predecessors in these specific valleys existed independently of and prior to the physical discoveries that the archive record then documented and then lost. 2 entirely separate lines of evidence arriving at the same category of information from opposite directions. 3 sources, no shared incentive to coordinate, the Osage oral tradition, the 19th century newspaper accounts, the WPA field reports, all pointing at the same valleys. All of those valleys are now underwater. If you're tired of being told that this pattern means nothing, subscribe and comment, no more lies. The manipulation only works if we stay quiet. Now, back to what all of this amounts to, because the final question is not what is down there. It is why flooding is the perfect way to make sure we never find out. Flooding is not destruction. That is the thing I keep coming back to. Fire destroys, demolition destroys. Flooding preserves in a specific and useful way. It renders inaccessible. Whatever is beneath those reservoirs is still there. The bones, if they exist as described. The stone chambers. The cave systems with their modified walls and their deliberate burials. All of it sitting in cold water under military jurisdiction, untouched, unreachable, and likely to remain that way indefinitely. That is either an unfortunate coincidence or it is something else. I cannot tell you which. I want to be honest about that. I have spent months with this material and I do not have a definitive answer, and I am not going to manufacture one for you. What I have is the pattern, and the pattern is this. Bones found, records filed, institutions notified, documentation trails gone quiet, land transferred, water arrived, access restricted, repeated across the Osage River Valley, the White River Corridor, the Table Rock Basin, the Bull Shoals Reach, repeated across 5 decades and multiple independent dam projects, each with its own engineering rationale, each arriving at the same geographic outcome, the same valleys, the same silence, the same depth of water between us and whatever is down there. 3 independent lines of evidence: indigenous oral tradition, 19th century archive documentation, federal field reports, all converging on the same category of find in the same landscape, now submerged beneath reservoirs controlled by the same military agency that built them. I don't know what that means. I know what it looks like. If this investigation is worth something to you, leave your thoughts below. Tell me what you see in this pattern. Tell me what I'm missing. This only moves forward if we think through it together. The next record in this ledger takes us somewhere I hesitated to go. A single name in a 1934 federal transfer document that connects these valleys to a much larger project. I'll be ready when you are. 33 inches, still unaccounted for, still down there.